Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I have been to St. Columba's many times and count its clergy and members among my friends. It's the first time, however, I get to play the big room, so I'm very excited. There are a number of things that fit with the theme that I understand is something new. So I wanted to reflect on a few things that Judaism brings into the world, the new ideas and concepts that Judaism gives to the world. First is the concept of the God that we worship, a God that is above nature, not a God in nature. There are many primitive religions that worship the sun and the moon. They worship gods understood to be in nature. Judaism introduces the idea of a God above nature, and in fact an invisible and spiritual God, which was a radical idea at the time. In fact, the Romans and the Greeks thought that Jews were atheists because we had no physical objects to worship. Even more interesting for me is the idea of a God of covenant. So this is an amazing idea. This is the idea that God and humanity, God certainly in the Jewish people, but God and humanity in general, have obligations to one another. If you think about the gods of mythology, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and so on, the gods would steal and the gods would fight, and creation actually occurs in some of the primitive stories of wars between the gods, and out pops the earth and humanity. Gods could pretty much do whatever they want, and the idea of sacrifice and worship was to appease the gods and bribe the gods. Judaism brings in a radically new idea, one of covenant. In Hebrew, the term brit or bris. The word testament actually comes from the word from covenant. The idea of covenant is that God has obligations to us, and we have obligations to God, and we can and should hold each other to those obligations. In the Hebrew Bible, we have this amazing story where God tells Abraham, his new partner, that God's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham argues with God. I love this idea, the idea of arguing with God. And Abraham says, now wait a minute, shall the God of justice not do justly? And Abraham enters into this amazing negotiation with God, arguing that for the sake ultimately of, if we can find 10 righteous people in the cities, we should spare the entire city for the sake of those 10 righteous. And God ultimately agrees. In fact, one of the things that I love about Judaism and about Hebrew is the word Israel. The word Yisrael means one who wrestles with God. An amazing, astounding concept, which is so obvious that you wouldn't think it was ever introduced, but is introduced by Jews and Judaism, is the concept that history has direction. Think about it. Before these times, before Judaism, in hunter-gatherer societies, slavery, caves, and so on, the concept that the world of your children and grandchildren would be better than your own world was absurd. Everybody knew my children and my grandchildren would have exactly the same world that I have. Judaism, through a group of newly freed slaves 3,200 years ago, introduces a radically new idea. The idea that we should progress from the bad old days to better new days. And although the progression may be slow, it won't happen instantly. It won't even happen in your lifetime. That's our job. In Judaism, the concept of Geulah, of salvation, is very much about this world, about making this world a better place. The concept of a Sabbath, Shabbat, is a radically new idea. There is nothing in nature that has a 7-day cycle. And Judaism introduces the idea that one day in 7, we should stop trying to make the world a better place. Making the world a better place is a full-time job. I often stress this, 24/6, full-time. But on the 7th day, we are to step back and enjoy the world that we have created. Judaism introduces the idea of God as a balance between compassion and justice. One of the names for God is Harachaman, the merciful one. And the term Rahman comes from the Hebrew word rechem, which means womb, uterus. The idea of loving, caring, compassion in the Hebraic mind is modeled after the loving, caring compassion of a mother for her child. Interestingly, in the Greek and Western mind, the word for womb is hyster, which becomes the source of the word hysterical. So in the Jewish mind, hyster, womb, is a sign of loving compassion. And Judaism introduces this idea that God is both just and merciful. In fact, the two words we often hear in the Bible for God, Adonai, which is often translated as Lord, and Elohim, which is God, stands for those two aspects. The rabbis tell a story of Roman times, Roman glassware, very fragile glass, and they say, if we pour very hot water into a glass object, it shatters. If we pour very cold water into a glass object, it shatters. And so too, if the world was created only with justice, it could not endure. And if the world was created only with love, it could not endure. So what do? You mix the cold water and the hot water, it survives, and God mixes compassion and justice, and the world survives. The rabbis ask the question, does God pray? I often love to ask a show. Let me do this. Let's ask a show of hands. How many of you think God prays? Raise your hands. Okay, the rabbis say yes, of course God prays. Probably because the rabbis love to pray, so they presume that God prays. Then they ask, what is God's prayer? And they say God's prayer is, may it be my will, I love that line, that my aspect of mercy overwhelm my aspect of justice. And in Judaism, many Jews are surprised to learn that Judaism has a concept of punishment in the afterlife. It's called Gehenna, and it's a maximum of 1 year for almost all crimes. And one of the nice things about Gehenna, if you can say something nice about Gehenna, is you get Shabbat off. One day in 7, the fires of Gehenna are extinguished. People go out. They actually, the medieval tale said they go to snow because they need some cooling off. And then Saturday night, it's back to Gehenna. Judaism introduces the idea that God focuses more on what we should do rather than what we should believe. Judaism is a religion which focuses on correct action rather than correct belief. And I often explain this by means of a simple example. Let's say we were all Orthodox Jews, and we're having this great discussion about the afterlife. And we're talking about what do each of us believe about the afterlife. And you believe in 7 heavens, and you believe in 3 heavens, and you believe in a place of punishment with a maximum of a year, and you believe in eternal punishment. And there's a authentic Jewish belief by the mystics, the Kabbalists, in reincarnation, and you believe in reincarnation. We're having this great discussion. And now at the end of this great discussion, we can't come to an agreement. Is that a problem? No. Now it's time for lunch. And we can't agree on whether this chicken is kosher. Is that a problem? Big problem. We can't eat. If you can't eat, that's a problem. If you can't agree on the afterlife, it's not such a big problem. At least it's not an immediate problem. That sort of typifies Jewish approach. There's a great Hasidic story about a rabbi teaching his students there are times in which you should act as if God does not exist. And his students are shocked. And, Rabbi, how is it we should act as if God doesn't exist? And the rabbi says, when you come across a poor person, a person in need, you should assume that God does not exist, and it's your job to help that poor person, rather than to pray that God will help the poor person. Judaism teaches not that everyone should be Jewish. If Judaism had as its goal that everyone should be Jewish, we would be doing a miserable job. I often ask, this probably is not the greatest venue to ask this question, what percent of the world do you think is Jewish? And I sometimes get answers as high as 5, 10, 15, 20%. The answer is 0.2%. If we rate God's batting average, baseball season's about to begin, if we rate God's batting average on how many Jews there are in the world, God is batting 2. On the other hand, Judaism teaches not that everyone should be Jewish. Judaism teaches that everyone should worship the God of Abraham. And it turns out about half of the world worships the God of Abraham, mostly Christians, largely Muslims, and a few Jews here and there. So on that task, God is batting about 500. Judaism introduces the amazing idea that God is a God that works in history. The opening of the Ten Commandments is, Anochi Adonai, I am the Lord thy God who brought you out of Egypt. If you think about it, God is introducing God's self to the Jewish people. How would you expect God to introduce God's self? I'm God, and oh, by the way, you see all this? I did it, okay? I created the universe. That's what you would think God would say to this people, but that's not what God says in the opening of the Ten Commandments. I brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Here is the idea that God works in history, a new and radical idea. An even more radical idea, I would say, emphasized in Jewish mysticism, is God cannot do the job alone. God needs humanity to do the job. What is the job? The perfection of the world, what we call in Hebrew tikkun olam, to make the world more like the one God has in mind. I just came across in recent weeks a concept, it's a Talmudic concept, I believe, of the question is, how does God spend God's day? Do you wonder about this? How does God spend God's day? And the answer might surprise you, at least in Jewish thought. 1/3 of God's day, God is listening to prayers and occupying God's self with the work of the world. 1/3 of God's day is, I'm sure the rabbis are projecting here, studying Torah. Is one of the concepts of heaven, one that I especially love, is that in the next life we get to study text all day long, lots of different translations, and difficult problems are resolved by the Messiah, whether it's that other rabbi or other rabbis sitting at the study table, and really difficult questions God resolves. So that's 1/3 of God's day. The last 1/3 of God's day I speak of at every wedding. The tradition is that God's most difficult job these days is matching couples, finding exactly the right bride for the right groom. Judaism understands the idea that God sends messengers into the world to do God's work. God cannot do it alone. God needs us. I often speak about this concept that imagine if God had created a perfect world. A world with no war, a world with no disease, a world with no anger, a world with no hatred, a world with no hunger, a world with no poverty. We would have nothing to do. We would literally have nothing to do. But the Torah teaches we are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Therefore, we must have serious work to do. Serious, creative, ethical work to do. So Judaism teaches that God sends into the world messengers. The Hebrew word for messenger is malach. It's the same as the Hebrew word for angel. So God sends us into the world. And through teachings like the ones you hear in this room, the ones we hear in synagogues, the ones we hear in churches throughout the world, the ones we hear in mosques, the ones we hear in religious institutions of all stripes and nature, we are taught and inspired to continue their work and to continue our job as angels. If I had thought about it and wouldn't be too noisy, I would ring a little bell at this point in time, which some of you will get because I believe you are angels doing God's work, and it is my delight and honor to be here as we continue to work on earning our wings. Thank you and good Sabbath.